Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Louisiana Public Broadcasting and the Southern University Law Center, we would like to thank you for joining us for this virtual preview screening of Coded Bias. I'm Robin Merrick, Vice President of External Affairs for the Southern University System, and tonight with our distinguished panel of experts, we will explore issues just raised in this powerful Independent Lens documentary. This is the first of 3 LPB preview screenings taking place through June of Independent Lens films surrounding the issues of civil liberties and criminal justice reform. I'd now like to welcome our 4 expert panelists who are joining us this evening. Angela Allen Bell, she's an associate professor and the B.K. Agnihotri Endowed Professor at the Southern University Law Center. Professor Bell is a respected local, national, and international legal scholar, an expert on civil and human rights, social and restorative justice, and the interplay between race and justice. It was her research that in 2018 successfully ended the use of non-unanimous juries here in Louisiana. Kelly Carmina, she's a criminal clinic supervising attorney at the Southern University Law Center. Prior to joining the faculty at Southern, Professor Carmina worked with the East Baton Rouge Parish Office of Public Defender as a felony and misdemeanor assistant public defender. During her 5-year term there, she served as lead counsel on a multitude of felony matters. Alana Odoms, she's executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Louisiana. As the first Black woman to lead the ACLU of Louisiana in its 65-year history, Ms. Odoms has answered the call to defend the Constitution and the Bill of Rights by challenging systemic racial and gender injustice. And lastly, Fanny Ramirez, assistant professor of media law, the Manship School of Mass Communication, LSU Interdisciplinary Center for Computation and Technology, and a research affiliate with the Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs. Professor Ramirez's research examines the use of information communication technologies in the criminal justice system with an eye towards issues of discrimination, privacy, and surveillance. Welcome to you all. To our audience, if you're watching and you have any questions, we ask that you just type them in the OV chat box. We might not be able to answer all of those questions this evening, but we will do our very best to get to as many of the questions as possible. So first, we'll get started with you, Professor Bell. I know this is a subject that is of interest to you. Tell us, does Coded Bias, the film that we've just previewed, raise any issues of significance specifically to the people of Louisiana?
It does. Privacy is the first of several issues that are significant to the people of Louisiana. We know that the federal government grants some broad privacy protections to everyone in this country, sort of some privacy surrounding health and financial data. But Congress leaves it to the states to decide if they want to confer even broader privacy protections to its people. Some states choose to do so, and Louisiana happens to be one of those states. So if you consult Louisiana's Constitution, you will see explicitly in the Constitution for the state the promise that there is such a thing as a privacy right. So people in Louisiana are protected from invasions of privacy by way of its state constitution. Now, I don't mean to convey to you that that is an absolute right in the state of Louisiana. But what I do mean to convey to you is that we do not intend in this state for the right to privacy to be infringed upon arbitrarily or indiscriminately. Beyond the state constitution, we have gone so far as to codify even greater protections to be sure it is clear that privacy is a preciously guarded right in the state of Louisiana. The legislature has codified protections surrounding cybersecurity, protections around electronic surveillance, protections around online account data, protections around oral communications. What we have not done yet as a state is to fashion some type of public policy position on the current matters of artificial intelligence. And what we have not done yet is fashioned a sufficient legislative response to the threats of privacy that are now visiting our citizens. At this moment, under Louisiana law, outsiders by way of this artificial intelligence can actually do to Louisiana citizens what Louisiana government actors cannot do, what Louisiana citizens can't do to each other, and what Louisiana employers would currently be punished from doing. A secondary issue of interest is due process. That too is a constitutional promise in this state, and that is also now being interrupted by the use of artificial intelligence in the way it is currently unregulated. Thirdly, we never intended in the state of Louisiana for bail or parole decisions to be automated. Under our law, we intended that those decisions would be carefully and meaningfully made so that it is clear to a judge and to the parole officials that a release decision is made about public safety and true risk assessment and not about mathematic formulas that make the process automated. And then we also need to remember that we are unique. Louisiana has a system of civil law. We are unlike any other jurisdiction in the nation, and that means something special. That means that it is not the companies that own the data that should dictate the practices of Louisiana. That means that the will of the people should dictate the practices of Louisiana, and that is now being threatened. And then finally, we have a history of racial problems in this state, and they have been visiting us too frequently. And this is not another layer of complexity that we are adding to something that we need not revisit as a state. We should be on the journey of transitional justice to improve and to heal where race relations are unsettled, and this undermines all of those efforts.
Professor Bell, I simply am saying wow, because clearly this documentary and the screening has brought up a number of issues, and you've outlined several of them just for the state of Louisiana. Certainly something for us to continue to look at. But along those same issues, Professor Carmina, I want to switch to you real quickly and ask, as someone who was a former public defender, do you think police or immigration enforcers should be allowed to search databases that store your driver's license or passport photo? Clearly, this is something that can move in that direction. And why or why not would you feel this way?
I think police are already searching our databases with our driver's license and things like that. It depends on how it's being used. For instance, immigration control is starting to use the databases for illegal immigrants who are allowed to get driver's license and their legal driver's license in certain states. But they will go through these databases and use these databases to try to pinpoint who is illegal, to use this information to prosecute them. Mm-hmm. Other police officers or police forces will use the databases to create photographic lineups. And in that regard, they already have a photograph of someone. They already have a suspect on hand, and they're just needing a positive identification from the victim or the complainant, whoever, whatever the case may be. That to me isn't as problematic as using the databases as a way to find these illegal immigrants or to find someone and search someone out for something illegal that they haven't adherently or been charged of so far.
Point well taken, and certainly one that we want to investigate a little bit more. Let's move over to the ACLU. Ms. Odoms, an important issue raised throughout the film is how civil rights can be at stake when it comes to automated decision-making. Tell us about what rights are at stake and what protections we need to safeguard our society as AI continues to develop.
Absolutely. So I just want to say Professor Bell did a beautiful job with laying out some of our fundamental constitutional rights, both at the federal level and at the state level. She spoke about a right to privacy, She spoke about a 14th Amendment right to due process. And we should also generally speak about our Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. And frankly, AI technology poses unreasonable searches on the individual, ones that the individual cannot even ascertain are happening. And as we saw in the Coded Bias film, we also saw folks' due process rights being completely trampled upon because, for example, in the instance of the teacher, the information that the algorithm had was just patently false. And so he wasn't able to defend himself against termination despite having a sterling record. So I want to just maybe, this might be a spirited conversation, but to even, just push back a bit on what Professor Carmina said in terms of photographic lineups and confirming the identity of individuals. We know the difficulty that these algorithmic equations have in identifying facial features for women and for people of color. And we also know, sadly, especially in Louisiana, how discriminatory our policing is. And so as a former prosecutor, I can tell you that when we put together photographic lineups, many times we included many individuals in those photographic lineups who we knew were not involved in the crimes. And we simply were we were being suggestive. And so if you're being suggestive with the individuals who you're asking to confirm the identity of, and then you're using this additionally discriminatory way of confirming that, essentially you have exactly what Kathy O'Neill said in the documentary, which is mathematics being a shield for corrupt practices. Mm-hmm. I was mortified by this. I'll be very honest. At the ACLU, we have a host of fundamental constitutional issues that we deal with every day. I knew surveillance and mass surveillance AI technology was incredibly problematic, incredibly discriminatory. I just had no idea how insidious it was. I knew that it took life and form by way of racially discriminatory risk assessment, where certain individuals are detained more likely because they're Black or because they're poor. I knew the impacts, some of the impacts on the criminal legal system. What I didn't know is that those impacts affect our credit, affect our right to obtain a mortgage, affect the type of medical care we might receive, impact all kinds of things that you just patently believe as a citizen and someone who pays taxes and someone who participates and follows the law, you perceive that you get a fair shake in these different areas of our lives. Mm-hmm. And knowing that we may not be getting that fair shake and that there's nothing that we can do to even interrogate that process makes me very uncomfortable as a lawyer and as a person who's concerned about our constitutional rights.
Like I said, this has opened up so many questions, just the screening that we've watched so far. And I know we won't be able to get to everything that we want to talk about tonight, but we're going to really try our best to at least touch on a number of the considerations that this film has brought to light. So Professor Ramirez, coming to you now, as someone whose work examines the use of communication technology specifically, what were your takeaways of the film and on the type of oversight and regulation advocated for by Joy Buolamwini and the other researchers that were featured?
Thank you, Robin. The question of oversight is a challenging one, and there is no definite answer yet. But the film presents three interesting options for us to consider. First, Kathy O'Neill calls for an Fda of Algorithms. So some kind of agency that would hold companies and the government accountable for algorithms that have the potential to drastically shape people's lives by impacting their finances or liberties. And the problem with that is, how do you define what counts as an algorithm? And what algorithms should be labeled as potentially harmful? The algorithms that courts use to determine sentencing seem a lot more dangerous than shopping algorithms that decide what products you see or what financing rates you are offered. But just like with microaggressions, I think these small algorithmic biases add up and they propagate inequalities. So the challenge really with this option is, how do you properly identify and classify algorithms to regulate? And so a second option would be to look at the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR that's been adopted by the European Union. And here algorithms are regulated indirectly by strict privacy, transparency, and security standards. So there are rules for how organizations deal with people's personal data, and people have the right to know what data are being collected and for what purpose. A good example of a security measure would be requiring social media platforms to have default settings that offer the maximum level of privacy to users. And if people and organizations are better at protecting privacy, less information can be swept up by algorithms. So you're basically regulating AI by limiting what algorithms can access and what they can do with information. Mm-hmm. And the last option discussed in the film is this idea of movements like the Algorithmic Justice League. And here the focus is really on raising awareness about the social implications of algorithmic bias. It's about creating grassroots movements that advocate for legislation and guidelines that would protect everyone, not just those in power. And so all that just to say that there's quite a bit more work to be done around AI, how to define it and how to regulate it.
Oh, definitely. Definitely, Professor Ramirez. And I really want to underscore the point about raising awareness, because if the film does nothing else, it certainly raises our level of awareness about what is going on, because I don't think any of us prior to viewing this really thought as deeply as this film explored on just all the areas that the algorithms and AI is really touching our lives in various ways. And on that note, I'll toss this question to you, Professor Ramirez, and then I'm going to come to you, Professor Bell. And these are questions from our audience that's watching. So thank you, audience, for sending us your questions in the OV chat box. We are monitoring it. So Professor Ramirez, how do you engage those writing the code in helping them understand that they may unknowingly be perpetrating injustices against themselves and others?
I think this goes back to how computers work, right? The machine is only as good as what we put into the machine. And so why are all the record management systems that police use biased? It's because the data that police officers put into the databases is biased, right? If they have an overwhelming amount of information on poor and Black neighborhoods, then what the algorithms draw on is this biased data point from the beginning. And so what I would tell people who develop code is to look at the source, look at what they are putting into the machine, because the machine can only produce an output based on what you give it. And so we need to change the code at the source. We need to change the data that goes into the algorithms.
One other audience question. Thank you, Professor Ramirez. One other audience question, and this is for you, Professor Bell. We are encouraged to put cameras everywhere for our protection. Who can we trust to be honest and truthful? And who are the vanguards leading in this movement to protect us from AI being out of control?
Well, I'm actually shocked to be able to report to you that what I have found as the most impressive effort thus far is not even in the country. It is actually out of the country. At the UN level, there has been a devoted body that was created in 2015. It is called the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, and they are devoted strictly to this issue of studying artificial intelligence. When is it in violation of civil and human rights protections? But of note, this body is tasked with data sharing. So anyone who is a part of the global community now can lean upon them for this study that they have been doing since 2015 on this issue. And they're giving very informed insights into how to shape legislation, how to shape the proper responses to what we are seeing. So that is encouraging. And in terms of who to trust, based on precedent, there is no one trustworthy. So again, we cannot have the mindset that we will legislate ourselves into a solution, particularly in a state like Louisiana. It is not designed to function that way. We are a state, the Constitution says government is by the people. The legislation is the will of the people. So once we get the legislation, the people have to police it and make sure that our systems are accountable to the people. So right now we're at the stage of just educating our people and then formulating strategy and coming up with a great public policy for the state. I liken this to the moment when we started having a real problem with sex offenders in the state. What do? We decided as a matter of public policy, if you open the legislation, it tells you, we will not tolerate this. And we became very creative about how we were going to regulate it. That's where we are as a state. And it is now the charge of every person watching this to express your outrage to every member of this legislature and then hold them accountable for implementing the changes that you wish to see after tonight's program.
Thank you, Professor Bell. Thank you for those questions to our audience. We really appreciate that. I'm going to toss this question out just for any one of our panelists to respond to. And it is about Social Security numbers. There's a thought that we're already being tracked by our Social Security numbers, and how is what we're seeing tonight any different than that? Who'd like to take that question?
Well, I'm not certain about whether or not we're being tracked by our Social Security numbers, but what I can tell you is that we are absolutely being surveilled in the city of New Orleans and perhaps in other cities where they've adopted mass surveillance. But we have something called the Real-Time Crime Center in New Orleans, and it was a $10 million, maybe upwards of $10 million project that the community had very little input in, where there are over 400 cameras located around the city. And in addition to those 400 city cameras, there are a network of private cameras that individuals can put up on their homes and businesses that feed into the Real-Time Crime Center. And all of those cameras are mounted in various locations around the city. But as you might imagine, more cameras are placed in communities of color and communities that are deemed to be high crime areas. And so we made a request pursuant to a public defender who wanted to obtain the location of all of the city cameras. Essentially, she wanted a map because she wanted to be able to use that map as far as representing one of her clients, and she was denied by the city. She was told, even though these cameras were paid for by taxpayer dollars, even though they are surveilling you and me and the rest of the community every day, we can't tell you where they are. So we sued and we won. And we were able to let the citizens and the residents of New Orleans know where all of these cameras were located and provide that map to the community. And so I think we're all under this false sense of security that we're not actually being surveilled. I mean, the movie tells us that even with the incredibly invasive system of surveillance that they have in communist China and in the United Kingdom, the United States is the most surveilled nation in the world, and we, the citizens, are more surveilled, and there's less regulation. And so I would venture to say, although I'm not an expert in this, that our Social Security numbers are a conduit for that. But more often than not, it is frankly that our local governments, municipalities, parishes are investing tens of millions of dollars in surveillance technology without consulting anyone in the community, and then deploying this surveillance technology in a host of different ways that are not subject to regulation and that people honestly don't know how they work. And so we were able to make inquiries of this Real-Time Crime Center and the individuals who work there, some of whom are not necessarily even trained in doing this kind of work, but are working in these facilities. And they are doing what's called proactive surveillance, which means they're just scanning faces in the French Quarter, perhaps, or they're scanning faces in a certain location just to do what is sometimes called proactive policing, which is nothing's going on. You're not committing any crime, but your face is being captured or the scene is being captured to determine if everything's okay. So what happens then if you look suspicious while walking down the street? And we know who generally looks more suspicious while walking down the street: women, people of color, people in certain neighborhoods. And so then there's a cascade of activity happening that you may not know why all of a sudden you've been accosted by a police, but maybe the Real-Time Crime Center has called over to a police officer that then stops you, and you've done nothing wrong. Your Fourth Amendment rights are violated, your 14th Amendment rights are violated, but you don't even know how it happened.
We're just walking down the street.
Just walking down the street.
It's
We saw it
incredible.
happen in the movie too. Those children who were just walking to school. How were they stopped? In the same proactive manner.
No question. Professor Carmina, I want to thank you guys again, but definitely Ms. Odoms, thank you for that response to one of our questions from the audience. Another question though, for Professor Carmina specifically, in the film, Amy Webb says, "I would prefer to see our Western democratic ideals baked into our AI systems of the future." So what ideals or values, if any, would you like to see incorporated into the AI development?
Well, obviously, several of them have already been discussed tonight. We have our Fourth Amendment rights to privacy that I'm not really sure how you would, I'm not smart when it comes to technology. So how you really incorporate that in, I'm not the expert to ask, but obviously we've still got to be able to protect our rights to privacy as American citizens. And we are a free nation. We do have that right that we are expected for the government to uphold. But Ms. Odoms brought something out I didn't even know about with New Orleans. Clearly what's going on in China and the UN is starting to happen here in America, and those rights are being stripped from our citizens. So biggest, most important to me would be our rights to privacy, our 14th Amendment rights. Maybe even you may get to a point to where how well do these cameras pick up audio? So then you've got a Fifth Amendment issue, right? If someone happens to confess to a crime, well, now you have a Fifth Amendment issue possibly. Like, it's just a plethora of things that I see, like just this molehill gradually becoming a mountain of just stripping away all of those rights that we have thought we had security in, and clearly we don't.
Yeah.
And may I also add, when we talk about the right to privacy, we're really talking about the right to be left alone. That's all that means. So when you think about a citizen trying to enjoy a Sunday evening out and they are being surveilled, that cuts through the foundation of what we intended for a government to operate as. We never designed a government in this country where citizens would interface with the government 24/7. That was never the design. So what we're creating now is a state where citizens really don't have a line of separation from government. So this is disruptive of not only constitutional principles, but this is now undermining the essence of who we are as a nation, because we never intended for the government to meddle in every second of every citizen's life. That is counter to who we are as a nation. So that is another reason why we should be getting ourselves very concerned, because this disrupts our identity as a nation if we were to allow this to continue without interruption.
Yeah, the intent of our nation, as well as not just the interface with the government, but the interface that we're seeing with private companies in terms of the access that they have to data. And while we said the intent or the use of that may not necessarily be malicious, it kind of dovetails into the next question that I was thinking of for you, Professor Ramirez, because this AI now starts to shape how we think, because the algorithms are working and it's making decisions for us and predicting our behavior as we go forward. So what are some examples in the news or social media that you've seen that that AI is shaping how we think?
Yeah, I think we see it, almost every day. And one way AI shapes how we think is by limiting what we see on social media. So algorithms use our past preferences to suggest new content and filter out things we might disagree with or things we might dislike. And this then leads to this echo chamber whereby the algorithm only recommends things that reinforce our existing beliefs. So unless you specifically seek out opposing viewpoints, you basically live in a filter bubble where you are isolated from certain content because of these algorithms. And this has severe implications for civic discourse and knowledge, because if we're exposed to new ideas that challenge our beliefs and encourage growth, then we're just, really restricted as individuals. And if you, look at your social media feed and the types of, just political news you're seeing, you probably will see that, the algorithms are at work behind the curtain.
Definitely. Thank you, Professor Ramirez. We have a boatload of more questions that we don't have time to get to, but I will just make this as a statement that March is Women's History Month, and not sure if the film unintentionally promoted women's history and its themes, or even that our panel tonight is promoting women's history, given that we're all women here this evening. So I'll just give a shout out for Women's History Month and the work that you four ladies are doing. And I certainly want to thank you for that, Professor Bell, Professor Carmina, Ms. Odoms, Professor Ramirez. Thank you for the time that you've shared with us this evening, and thank you for the work that you're doing specifically in this area. I really feel like this will not be our last conversation. This has piqued our interest in ways that I don't know that we intended when we started out, but I do think this is ripe for more discussion in the coming days and weeks and months. And so for those of you who are attending the event this evening, we ask that you watch your email for a survey about tonight's event. We ask that you complete the survey online and we will enter you into a drawing. You could win a free LPB passport membership, and we want to be able to share that with you. As a reminder, the full-length version of Coded Bias premieres on LPB next Monday, March the 22nd, from 9 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. And for information on LPB's next Independent Lens preview screening, you can go to lpb.org/PhillyDA for more information. And once again, in addition to our wonderful panelists, LPB would like to extend our thanks to our partners who helped make this evening possible. The Southern University and the Southern University Law Center. A special thanks to John Pierre, the Chancellor of the Law Center. Independent Lens and ITVS, that is Independent Television Service. And we also want to be mindful that support is being provided by ITVS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, MacArthur Foundation, Wynkotte Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Again, we want to thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Robin Merrick, and for all of us here at Louisiana Public Broadcasting, good night.